and welcome back. As my collection of drums and musical equipment has grown to accommodate my needs, I've had to get creative on finding places to store this equipment, as much of it isn't always small or compact. For me, on top of storing all the equipment you see behind me in my studio, there's also a number of other spots I store various parts and other equipment that I don't use on a daily basis. So in today's video, I want to talk about a number of ideas for storing and organizing all of my musical related equipment. One of the more obvious choices for storage is shelving. And I'm not saying this is my idea or anything, but I use it all over the place, not only for storing my drum equipment, but in some cases, displaying it. I have a small landing coming from the garage into my basement, and it's always been a perfect space for most of the equipment I use on a regular basis for gigging. I built these 3 large shelves to hold most of the larger pieces I use, like PA speakers, drums, hardware, and cymbals. When I initially built them, I made sure to make them plenty deep and leave more room than I thought I needed between the shelves, just in case my equipment changed over time, which it certainly has. But as much as this works fine, what I really want to highlight here in this first idea is using adjustable shelving. Years ago, I started buying these multi-tiered adjustable wire shelving units, and they've been so great for me as my needs have changed over time. The ones I'm using are typically 18 inches deep and 48 inches wide, but you can buy a variety of different sizes from all sorts of stores. I typically like to take something like a carpet material and cut out liners for the shelves where I store drums, but you can also buy plastic liners for these shelves already cut to size. Also, you'll notice behind my main set of drums, I cut some plywood pieces to fit in the shelves, and this works as a desk for me either when I'm teaching lessons or when I'm recording and need a place for my computer or to write things down. These shelves are plenty durable, and you can even thread wheels onto the bottom so they'd be easy to move around with all the drums on them, but really, the best part about them is the ability to adjust the shelving positions and create pockets that fit what you're trying to store perfectly. In my back storage room, you can see that I've merged multiple units together by sharing a vertical support between adjacent shelves, and this saves a little space and requires less parts to use overall. I see a lot of other drummers on social media using shelving just like this, and I personally love the look of it behind me when I'm on video, as I think it almost acts like a gallery wall for all the various drums, cymbals, and instruments that I use on a regular rotation. Since I spend so much time repairing and modifying drums, I tend to store and hoard all sorts of small parts and pieces that I can hopefully use on future projects. For years, I would just throw all these parts into a few different bins, but it made it a huge challenge when I would go to look for something specific, like a 2-inch tension rod for a snare drum, or a specific mount for a vintage tom. Over the last few years, I started to acquire a few portable parts bins that come with various dividers for storing all sorts of similar parts. These work great for tension rods, lugs, snare throw and butt plates, and other smaller odds and ends. What makes these really great, though, is that I can grab and take the whole thing with me when I'm working on a drum. For larger parts, or parts that I have large quantities of, I'll use dedicated storage totes that I can also grab and take with me. I try to keep everything labeled, but it's super helpful having all of these containers be clear, so I can see exactly what's in there with my own eyes. This method certainly doesn't work for everything, but I do find it super helpful with my workflow, as this saves me so much time looking for specific parts when I'm working on a drum. One of the things that has challenged me for years is how to store various stands for both microphones and drums. I've gotten creative at times, even going as far as storing some stands between my ceiling joist, which is typically a dead space. I've always felt like it would be efficient to have stands in the gaps between vertical studs, so years ago, I put up a simple 1x2 strip so that I could put stands in those gaps and not have them fall out. But after years of this simple setup, I feel like I can improve on this concept. The 3.5-inch depth of a stud isn't quite deep enough to store most of my mic stands and drum hardware, especially at the tripod base of stands. Also, I'd like to have a solid face to the front that goes all the way down to the floor, so the stands can't slide out the bottom or anything like that. So I started by ripping some scrap wood into 1.5-inch strips on my table saw, and then cut them down on my miter saw in order to bump out the depth of my studs along the floor and 2 feet up the wall. I took these downstairs and secured them in place with my nail gun, and since almost none of this would be visible, it was a great opportunity to use some leftover scrap wood. I then took some 1/4-inch MDF boards and cut them down to size and screwed them into those strips to create a solid face for the cubbies. You could certainly do this for a lot cheaper than I did by using scrap wood for the face, but I really wanted these to not only look good, but be as thin as possible, and most of my scrap plywood both looks pretty ratty and is typically 3/4 inches thick. In the end, I think this works great and looks good at the same time. It's extremely convenient for quickly organizing and grabbing both my mic stands and cymbal stands. I did consider adding some vertical dividers inside the cubbies so that it would just be one stand per gap, but since I now have 7 different gaps to store this equipment in, I haven't needed to store more than a few stands per slot yet. I've always appreciated having hooks around to hang up things like cables, but in the drum world, there seems to be plenty of other things that fit nicely on hooks, like auxiliary instruments, muffling tools, and spare drum rims. You can buy these small and large metal hooks from any hardware store, and although they work great for some things like cables and tambourines, I've found them to not be totally efficient for other things like drum rims or dampening rings. For years now, I've just been throwing these spare rims on the hooks, but when I go to look for a specific size or hole pattern, I end up having to take everything off and digging through to find the one that I need. Recently, I found that metal piping and pipe flanges can work great for these sorts of things, and I have tons of them left over from some furniture I made when I first got this house. I started by adding some scrap wood planks between my studs so that I could mount the flanges a little further back and not to the end of the stud. Since studs are typically mounted 16 inches on center, that means that the gap between two should be wide enough for me to store any hoops 14 inches or smaller. After getting the wood backers in place, I could then go ahead and screw in these metal flanges before threading in some small pipes to support the rims. I ended up hanging a number of these brackets so that I could try to keep my different size hoops on separate hooks, but for a couple of these, I even added multiple pieces so that I could nest some of the smaller hoops inside the larger ones. This works great, and yes, I did finally label all of these hoops so that I could more easily tell what they are. But if the metal industrial look isn't quite your vibe, you can also do this with wood dowels, like I did in my studio where I store my dampening rings. I already had one of these in place, but as my collection of rings has grown, it's been nice to have multiple hooks to keep things separated and organized a bit. Storing things like bass drum beaters and drum keys can be a pain, and I've accumulated so many over the years that I just end up keeping them in some sort of small parts bins or totes, but I thought recently it could be nice to have a few easy and quick to grab, while trying to have it look a bit more intentional than just throwing on a shelf. I've seen lowboy beaters have these displays made out of 4x4s for the drum shops that carry their beaters, and it seems to be super simple, so I figured I'd just replicate that onto a piece of 2x6 scrap I had in my garage. I took this over to my dad's shop since he has a drill press, because I knew this would look pretty amateur if these beaters didn't all stand up straight at the same angle. Once we figured out where to set the depth and what size drill bit to use, I measured out a pattern where the beater heads wouldn't run into each other, and then got to drilling all of the holes. Since I don't need to store 16 beaters, I ended up cutting this in half, and then trimming off a bit of the excess on the sides before going over it with the sander and a trim router. Next, I could put on a coat of stain, and then follow that up with some coats of polyurethane for a nice finish. I think this display looks really nice, and it allows me to quickly grab a beater when I'm swapping out for different recordings. I took pretty much the same concept and applied it for drum keys by taking another piece of scrap and then drilling holes where I could tap in some really shallow tension rods. If you drill these holes a little undersized, you don't really need to use any sort of glue to keep them in place, and will still have the ability to rip out these tension rods later if you decide to use them on an actual drum. The one I made here is just meant to hold a few keys, but I know there are people out there who collect drum keys, and for those people, maybe you could create a more grand display with multiple tiers to display the wide variety of drum keys you have. I also like the idea of just taking one of these tension rods and adding it into my desk hutch, since this is the spot where I change drum heads most often. I have an appreciation for things that make sense, and storing a drum key in the same style of way that you'd actually use it makes too much sense. Also, it allows them to stand up straight and be seen, while not being obstructed by anything supporting or holding it. If anybody watching this video would be interested in something like this, maybe it's something I could produce and sell, so leave a comment down below if that appeals to you. If you don't want to mess around with woodworking at all, but still want a way to quickly store bass beaters, drum keys, and other metal parts, I've used magnet strips forever. I typically buy these at my local Harbor Freight, but you can find them in a ton of different sizes on Amazon. I use these a ton in my garage for tools, and it's great because you can keep things out and visible for when you need to find them, and you don't need to mess around with pesky hooks that can pull out of pegboard. I will say that as much as I love this idea, I have had a few kick beaters or drum keys that didn't hold well, so I guess that means those specific parts were made out of another metal, like aluminum, copper, brass, gold, or silver. Cymbals are something I think a lot of us drummers tend to accumulate over time, because unlike drums, you're pretty limited with how you can augment the sound of a cymbal, and you certainly can't tune it. But unlike drums, cymbals are a lot easier to store a large quantity of, since they're mostly flat. I've seen a ton of drummers embrace the idea of using guitar stands for cymbals, and although I do love this idea, I've personally taken a slightly different approach. I've opted to build some small cubbies that I can store within my wire shelving units, with a few different dividers to split up hi-hats, crashes, and rides. This works really well for me, and as an added bonus, you can actually mic this area up and use it as a faux echo chamber for drum tracking, all while keeping the cymbals nicely tucked away. I'm a huge proponent of Pegboard, and it's been the primary storage system I've used in my garage since I bought my house almost 10 years ago. Keeping things in a visible space where you can easily see it and quickly grab it is super helpful when you're trying to work efficiently. A couple years ago, I decided to expand on that storage system and built a wood pegboard with dowels for the space in my landing where I keep all of my gigging equipment. The dowels are a bit bulkier than the small hooks and parts that work with most pegboards, and it allows me to hang things like cables, headphones, and mounts that I need to take with me for gigs. I also built some shelves that can lay over 2 dowels for some of the things that I want to store here, but don't have the ability to hang off a dowel. Last year, I took this same model down into the studio where I have my desk, and it's been great for storing some of the camera gear and recording equipment that I want quick access to. Again, the name of the game here is flexibility, and this setup allows me to change the layout whenever I need, so as my equipment changes, I can adjust my setup. And again, I think it looks nice, and why shouldn't the storage systems we use also look pleasing if they're going to be out in the open? This is a concept that I've tried to recommend to the various schools I work at for their percussion equipment. I've seen tons of pictures on different percussion and band director forums where they've done this, and it's amazing how great this can work for all sorts of auxiliary instruments and mallets. Storing drum heads has been a huge challenge for me over the years, and it's something that I'm still very much trying to figure out. Sure, I can stack them up like bricks one on top of the other, but it makes it nearly impossible to tell what each head is, and forces me to remove all of them to shuffle through and find the one I want. A while back, I did start taking full sets of drum heads and putting them in old drum head boxes, so that if I was looking to find a matching set of heads, I wouldn't have to do that process multiple times for each size drum head. This works really well, especially if you're good about labeling what's in each box. In the past few weeks, as I've gone through this storage room and tried to organize it, I found this idea online of taking bungee cords and weaving them through my wire shelving to create some dividers for my bass drum heads. I was surprised at how well this worked, and it allows me to keep heads stored vertically, which makes it much easier to slide one out from the middle while not having the rest of them fall over. I'm not sure if this is something I'll expand on over to my smaller heads I have, but when I saw this idea on the drum forum, it was definitely a eureka moment, as it's a problem I've been dealing with for years. So after sharing a number of my own ideas for storing and organizing my drum equipment, I wanted to save this next one for last because it's a bit unconventional. When I bought this house as a single 25-year-old, I didn't have much furniture or art to fill up my space, but I did have a nice collection of drums already. Some of these pieces I rarely or never used for playing, but I enjoyed the appearance of, so it ended up in my living room, dining room, or even my bedroom. Displaying different instruments or other drum-related equipment around the house has given me some bonus space in my studio for the equipment I do use regularly, and it also highlights how unique and beautiful some of this equipment is. All over my house, I have vintage drums, shells, kick pedals, heads, and even some previous projects displayed, and it makes this space sort of a museum exhibit for the people that come through here. Now, as you may expect, when my wife moved in, some of this stuff was sent back down to the basement, but she does approve of a few pieces still, and if she didn't, maybe we would have never ended up married in the first place. If you've made it this far along in the video, I appreciate you watching, and I'd love to hear your ideas for drum storage and organization, so let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on my future video releases. And until next time, thanks.